Some killers announce themselves in the blood they spill. They arrive loud. They leave wreckage. They are the kind of threat that every intelligence division in every fortified pack territory is structured to receive, because they match the shape of the thing the division was built to detect. They are the expected variable. The known danger. The type that fills the threat reports and populates the training scenarios and keeps the patrol schedules at their highest rotation. And then there is the other kind. The kind who arrives quietly. Not because they lack the capacity for violence, but because they understand something more sophisticated than violence. They understand that the best approach to a heavily defended position is to become invisible to the defense mechanism, and the best way to become invisible to a defense mechanism is to study exactly what the mechanism is trained to look for and then become precisely everything that mechanism ignores. The Kelvrath Pack's defense mechanism was exceptional. 5 years of reconstruction under a feared alpha had made it the most sophisticated security apparatus in the 5 territories, and every wolf who wore the intelligence insignia at Kelvrath Fortress understood what the insignia demanded: total awareness, zero complacency, the perpetual application of trained attention to every variable in the environment. They were looking for a killer. They were looking in every direction except the one where the killer actually was. They were looking at the entries, the exits, the formal guest registers, the scent signatures at the boundary posts, the behavioral patterns of every wolf in the fortress who carried a rank high enough to move through the secured corridors without escort. They were not looking at the Omega girl who cleaned the west wing of the fortress every morning between the 3rd and 5th hour, who had been doing it for 3 years without incident, whose scent profile was so familiar to every guard in the wing that it had become part of the environmental baseline, the kind of presence that trained attention learns to filter out because it has been catalogued as irrelevant. Her name was Maren Solis. She was 23 years old. She was the only wolf in Kelvrath Fortress who had detected the killer 11 days before anyone else identified the threat. This is the account of what she did about it. If this story has already found its grip on you, you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe now and follow every chapter through to its end. Hit that subscribe button. Like and comment where you are watching from. Now let's begin the story. The west wing of Kelvrath Fortress was considered, by most of the ranked wolves who passed through it, to be the least interesting section of the building. The east wing held the Alpha's war chamber, the intelligence offices, the council rooms where decisions that shaped the lives of 5,000 pack wolves were made and documented and sealed with the Kelvrath iron mark. The north wing held the residences of the Alpha and his senior staff, the private library, the rooms that carried the specific weight of consequence and authority. The south wing held the training grounds, the armory, the processing stations for the intelligence division's field communications. The west wing held the administrative records, the archival storage, the maintenance workshops, and the long corridors of quiet utility that kept the fortress functioning without producing anything that looked like power. Maren Solis had been assigned to the west wing at the age of 20, when she arrived at Kelvrath on a routine Omega placement from the Delmere territory. The placement officer had reviewed her profile with the efficiency of someone moving through 40 placements in a single afternoon and had matched her to the West Wing maintenance rotation on the basis of her competency scores in organized systems management, which were high, and her social profile, which indicated a preference for independent work structures, which was the polite assessment language for a wolf who functioned better without supervision. She had not objected. She had not particularly wanted a different assignment. She had wanted, in the specific and limited sense that 3 years of West Wing work had refined into clarity, to understand the place she lived in well enough to move through it with intelligence. The West Wing had given her that. 3 years of early morning hours in the administrative corridors had produced in Maren a map of Kelvrath Fortress that was more detailed and more accurate than any map held by the Intelligence Division, because her map was not drawn from reports and briefings and surveillance data. It was drawn from direct observation, repeated daily, in the particular conditions of the 3rd and 4th hour when the fortress was at its most unguarded, when the night staff were finishing their rotations and the day staff had not yet arrived to take their positions, and the building existed in its own quiet truth without the performance that daytime occupation produced. She knew the scent of every wolf in the West Wing the way she knew her own name. Not because she had studied them or catalogued them with any particular intention, but because 3 years of daily proximity had loaded the information into her memory with the same unconscious thoroughness that living in a place loads its geography into the body. She knew the specific sent signature of the archives clerk who arrived early twice a week and spent the extra time in the secondary records room for reasons he had not volunteered and she had not asked about. She knew the night guard captain whose post at the West Corridor Junction smelled slightly different on the days he was managing a recurring joint injury he had not disclosed to the medical wing. She knew the 2 administrative assistants whose desk areas carried the persistent undertone of a shared anxiety that had been present for about 6 weeks and that she had identified, from context, as connected to the budget allocation review the Alpha was conducting that quarter. She knew all of it. She carried all of it. She had never had a formal mechanism for doing anything with it, so she had filed it in her own notation system and continued her work and waited, in the patient way of wolves who have learned that information eventually finds its use if it is accurately held. On the morning of the 11th day before the Convergence Assembly, she was working the 3rd corridor from the archive wing when something entered her awareness that was not in the baseline. Not a scent she did not recognize. She recognized it. It was the scent of Counselor Darvin Hall, the second-ranking member of the Kelvrath Council, who used the West Wing administrative corridor on his way to the early records review 3 mornings per week and whose scent profile had been in her mental catalog for 2 years. What was not in the baseline was the compound layered underneath it. It was faint. Extraordinarily faint, the kind of faint that required not just a good nose but the specific advantage of a nose that had spent 3 years learning this wing's environmental chemistry so thoroughly that it could detect a deviation of parts per million against the established baseline. Most wolves would have passed through the corridor and registered nothing. The Intelligence Division's sweep team, which conducted scent analysis of the secured corridors twice daily, would have passed through and registered nothing. The trace was below the threshold of the sweep team's detection protocol, which had been calibrated for the concentration levels associated with standard threat compounds. What it was not below was Maren's threshold. She knew the compound. She had encountered it once before, in a different context entirely, during her first year at Kelvrath when she had been assigned to assist in the medical wing for 2 weeks following a staff shortage. The compound was a contact paralytic, specifically a variant used in precision operations that required a target to be incapacitated without the visible evidence of a conventional attack. It had a shelf life of roughly 14 days once prepared, which meant it had been prepared recently, and it had a specific chemical fingerprint that told her it was not sourced from the Kelvrath medical stores, which used a different formulation. She finished the corridor. She continued her work. She did not change her pace or her pattern, because changing her pace or her pattern in a monitored environment was the same as announcing that she had noticed something, and she had not yet decided what noticing this meant or what she intended to do with it. What she had decided, standing in the 3rd corridor with the mop and her bucket and the smell of old stone and cleaning compound and the faint chemical signature of something that should not be there, was that Counselor Darvin Hall, who was the second most powerful wolf in Kelvrath, had been in physical contact with a precision paralytic that was not sourced from the Kelvrath stores. She had also decided that this was the kind of information that required careful handling, because the second most powerful wolf in a pack was also the second most dangerous wolf to have as an enemy, and she was an omega in the West Wing maintenance rotation, and the gap between those 2 positions in the formal hierarchy was not theoretical. She went back to her quarters at the end of the shift. She sat on the edge of her bed and ran the full calculation. She ran it 3 times, because she had learned early that calculations involving significant risk needed to be run more than once to ensure the variables were correctly weighted. The calculation produced the same result all 3 times. She picked up her notation book and began writing. The Convergence Assembly was the annual gathering of the 5 territorial pack leaders at which the terms of the Inter-Pack Compact were reviewed, amended, and re-ratified. It was held in rotation across the 5 territories, and this year it fell to Kelvrath to host. The assembly would bring to Kelvrath Fortress, over a period of 4 days beginning in 11 days' time, for visiting Alpha-rank wolves and their senior delegations. Which meant roughly 200 additional bodies inside the security perimeter, which meant that any plan that required specific conditions in the fortress during the assembly period had approximately 160 hours of the assembly in which to execute. The Kelvrath Alpha, whose name was Vale Dorn and whose reputation in the 5 territories had been built over 12 years of decisions that his enemies described as ruthless and his pack described as absolute, had been managing the assembly's security architecture for 3 months. The Intelligence Division's pre-assembly threat assessment had been circulated 2 weeks ago. It identified 14 specific risk scenarios, each with a corresponding mitigation protocol, and it was thorough and professional and had been prepared by wolves who were very good at their jobs. It had not identified the compound in the third corridor of the West Wing, because the compound in the third corridor of the West Wing had been brought in by a council member, and the threat assessment's framework for council members was a lateral risk analysis rather than a direct threat analysis, which was the correct framework for most circumstances and the incorrect framework for this one. Maren had read the threat assessment. She had access to it because it had been filed in the administrative archive as part of the assembly preparation documentation, and she had access to the administrative archive because she was responsible for its cleaning and maintenance, and the files in it were not classified at a level that required her to look away from them. She read it carefully. She identified the gap. Then she began the second and considerably more difficult problem: what to do with what she knew. The formal reporting channel available to Omega-ranked staff at Kelvrath Fortress was a written submission to the Wing Overseer, who would evaluate the submission and escalate it or file it based on their assessment of its credibility and urgency. The West Wing Overseer was a senior beta named Cord who had held the position for 4 years and was, in Maren's considered assessment, a competent administrator who processed submissions with reasonable efficiency and whose primary limitation was a systematic tendency to weight the credibility of a report against the rank of the wolf who submitted it rather than against the quality of the evidence the report contained. This was not unusual. It was the standard failure mode of hierarchical reporting systems, and it was predictable, and she had spent 2 years in the West Wing learning to predict it with enough accuracy to know that a report from an Omega about a compound she had detected at parts per million concentration in a corridor, implicating the second-ranking counselor in the pack, would be received by Cord with the specific quality of attention that a supervisor gave to something that required careful management rather than immediate action. He would file it. He would note her mental state. He would possibly flag her for the medical wing assessment that was the standard response to Omega staff who produced anomalous reports, because the framework for anomalous reports from the lower ranks included mental health assessment as a first response procedure, which was both institutionally cautious and procedurally useless. She closed her notation book. She looked at the wall of her quarters, which was the wall shared with the corridor she had been cleaning for 3 years, and she thought about what the compound in the third corridor meant in terms of the assembly, the visiting pack leaders, the Alpha King who was the primary target of any threat serious enough to require a precision paralytic. She thought about the gap in the threat assessment. She thought about Cord and the mental health assessment flag. She made a decision that was, from any conventional assessment of her position and her rank and her options, well outside the authority she formally possessed. She decided to go directly to the Alpha King. Not because she had any mechanism for doing this. She did not. Omega-ranked maintenance staff did not have a pathway to direct access to the Alpha. The formal hierarchy between her position and his contained 8 distinct levels, each of which had its own access control and its own credibility threshold and its own procedural requirement for upward transmission of information. She decided to go directly to the Alpha King because the 8 levels between them were the same 8 levels that had produced the threat assessment with the gap in it, and because the gap in the threat assessment was the reason the compound in the third corridor had not already been detected and acted on, and because she had run the calculation 3 times and the result was always the same. The only way this information reached the correct destination in time to matter was if she took it there herself. She needed a way in. She spent the rest of that evening working out how to find one. The way in presented itself, as the best approaches to difficult problems often did, not as a door but as a crack in a door that already existed. Maren had been in the fortress for 3 years. 3 years of early morning hours in the West Wing had given her, among other things, a detailed understanding of the fortress's informal social geography, the paths that wolves of different ranks actually used versus the paths they were formally supposed to use, the times when high-ranking wolves moved through spaces that were technically below their usual operating level, the points of overlap between the official architecture of a place and the lived reality of it. One of those overlap points was the secondary entrance to the fortress library. The main entrance to the library was on the second floor of the North Wing, properly secured and accessible only to wolves of beta rank and above during the standard operating hours. The secondary entrance was a service corridor door on the first floor north that connected the library's lower storage section to the maintenance access pathway that ran along the North Wing's service level. The door was in Maren's cleaning rotation. It was, technically, accessible to her as part of her work assignment. The library's lower storage section was directly adjacent to the private reading alcove that the Alpha used in the evenings when he wanted to work without the North Wing's formal atmosphere, which Maren knew because the alcove was also in her cleaning rotation and because it bore the specific evidence of regular use. The chair positioned at a consistent angle, the lamp worn at the base from repeated handling, the specific sense signature of a wolf who used this space regularly and privately, without staff. She was not going to walk into the Alpha's private alcove uninvited. That was not the plan. The plan was more precise than that. The Convergence Assembly's preparation schedule, which she had read in the administrative archive, included a briefing session for the Alpha on the Assembly's security architecture, scheduled for the evening of the 8th day before the Assembly, held in the North Wing Council Room. The briefing was led by the Intelligence Chief. It was attended by the Alpha's second, and the Intelligence Division's 2 senior analysts. The council room where the briefing was held was connected to a preparation anteroom. The anteroom was stocked with reference documents for the briefing, which were prepared by the administrative archive team and physically delivered to the anteroom the morning of the briefing day. The physical delivery was conducted by the West Wing administrative staff. Maren requested, through the standard internal task allocation system, to be assigned to the physical delivery of the council room briefing materials on day 8. The task was minor enough that no one questioned the request. It was assigned to her within the hour. She had 8 days to prepare what she was going to say. She spent those 8 days doing 3 things simultaneously. The first was her regular work. She maintained her usual schedule without deviation, because a maintenance worker who suddenly changed their patterns in the days before a significant Fortress event would be noticed by the Intelligence Division's behavioral monitoring, which was passive but thorough, and being noticed by the behavioral monitoring before she had access to the Alpha was a failure state she could not recover from. The second was continued observation of the compound's trace. She worked her rotation each morning with the full attention of her nose, tracking the compound's presence or absence in the corridors she cleaned, building a map of its distribution pattern that told her things the initial detection alone had not. The compound trace was present in 3 locations: the 3rd corridor of the West Administrative Wing, the entrance to the secondary records room where the archives clerk spent his early hours, and the service passage that connected the Administrative Wing to the North Wing's lower level. This distribution pattern was not consistent with a single contact event. The compound was being reapplied or redistributed through the Fortress in small quantities over time, which meant whoever was carrying it was making repeated transits through these 3 locations with the compound on their person or their equipment. 3 locations. 1 linking corridor. 1 destination, the North Wing's lower level, which connected upward to the private residential quarter of the Alpha King of Kelvrath. She recorded this in her notation book in the cipher she had developed in the 2nd year of her placement, which was not a sophisticated cipher but was her own, which meant it was effectively unreadable to anyone who had not developed it. The 3rd thing she did in those 8 days was write the briefing. Not a request. Not a report. A briefing, structured the way the Intelligence Division structured its own threat briefings according to the format she had observed in the documents passing through the administrative archive over 3 years. Evidence base first. Threat assessment second. Confidence level third. Recommended action fourth. Clean, specific, professional, written in the language of the mechanism it was addressed to rather than the language of the rank that produced it. She rewrote it 4 times. She tightened it each time. By the 4th version it was 11 pages and could be read in 9 minutes and contained no sentence that was not doing necessary work. On the morning of the 8th day she folded it into the internal document folder she had prepared and placed it among the briefing materials for the council room delivery. The delivery went without incident, which was to say exactly as planned, which was to say that the anteroom was empty when she arrived with the materials and she placed them on the preparation table in the order specified by the briefing coordinator's instructions and then remained in the anteroom organizing them, because the instructions also specified that a staff member should be available in the anteroom during the briefing in case the Alpha or the Intelligence Chief required additional materials from the archive. She sat in the anteroom chair and waited. The briefing began on the other side of the council room door at the appointed hour. She could hear it through the door the way you heard things through interior walls, the shape of sound rather than its content, the register of voices, the particular quality of a room where significant people were discussing significant things. 40 minutes in, there was a recess. The door to the anteroom opened. The intelligence chief emerged first, a lean, precise wolf named Tava Asi, 51 years old, whose reputation in the 5 territories was built on the same quality as her appearance: nothing wasted, everything deliberate. She registered Maren's presence in the anteroom with a single sweep of her eyes that covered and filed everything visible in approximately half a second. She asked, in the clipped register of someone conducting a rapid environmental assessment, "Are you the staff assigned to the anteroom?" Maren confirmed it, "Yes." Administrative Archive, West Wing. Maren Solis. The intelligence chief looked at her for one additional second. Then she moved to the document table and located the secondary analysis her team had prepared. Behind her, the Alpha King of Kelvrath entered the anteroom. Maren had seen Vale Dorn at a distance many times in 3 years of fortress work. She had seen him in the formal context of the North Wing corridors, in the brief passage through the West Wing administrative corridor he made once a month during his routine walkthrough of the fortress's operational sections. She had never been in the same room as him at a distance of less than 10 meters. He was 36 years old. Tall, dark-haired, built with the density of a dominant wolf who had been in active combat operations until 4 years ago when the pack's consolidation had shifted his function from field to governance, though the body did not appear to have been informed of this shift. His eyes were the gray-gold of a predator assessing terrain rather than a person assessing a room, and they conducted the same sweep as the intelligence chiefs but at a different speed and with a different quality. Not cataloging, weighing. He looked at Maren. She did not drop her gaze. She was sitting in the anteroom chair in the position that the task assignment required, holding the document folder that contained the briefing she had spent 8 days writing, and she was aware that this was the only opportunity she was going to have and that the opportunity was approximately 60 seconds wide. She spoke before he looked away. Her voice came direct and level. "I am the maintenance worker assigned to the West Wing administrative corridors. I have been in that rotation for 3 years. I detected a contact paralytic compound in the 3rd corridor 11 days ago at a concentration below the sweep team's detection threshold. I have been tracking its distribution pattern for 11 days. The pattern indicates repeated transit through 3 locations in the West and North Wing service passages. I have prepared a full briefing document. It is 11 pages and takes 9 minutes to read. I am asking for 9 minutes." The anteroom was very quiet. The intelligence chief, who had found her document and had been preparing to return to the council room, had stopped moving. The Alpha King had not moved at all. He was looking at Maren with the gray-gold eyes doing the weighing thing, and she held his gaze with the specific quality of attention she had been developing for 3 years in the West Wing corridors, fully present, no performance, exactly what it was. He extended his hand. She placed the document folder in it. He sat down in the chair across from her in the anteroom, opened the folder, and began to read. The intelligence chief came and stood behind him and read over his shoulder. Neither of them said anything for 9 minutes. Maren sat in her chair and waited with the stillness she had developed for the early morning hours when the fortress existed in its own quiet truth, when there was nothing to do but observe accurately and hold what she observed until the moment it became useful. The moment had arrived. She waited for it to complete. He read it twice. She could tell because the quality of his attention changed between the first pass and the second. The first was reception, the second was analysis, the recombination of the components she had laid out in sequence. When he finished the second reading, he set the document folder on the anteroom table and looked at her. His voice came in the register she had not expected, which was not the formal authority of the Alpha addressing an Omega but the direct register of a wolf addressing another wolf whose information he was taking seriously, the distribution pattern. The service passage connection to the north lower level. You are certain of the locations? Her answer came without equivocation. She had walked those corridors every morning for 3 years. The baseline was absolute. The deviation was specific and repeated, and she had documented its exact location and concentration in the briefing's appendix. He looked at the intelligence chief. Tava Aussie's expression was the professional expression of someone who was running an internal calculation and had not finished it. Then she produced a precise statement. The sweep team's detection threshold for contact paralytics is calibrated to the Kelvrath Medical Store's formulation. A different formulation at sub-threshold concentration would be invisible to the sweep protocol. This is a documented gap in the current architecture. He looked back at Maren. His voice came quiet and exact. You identified this gap. She offered the accurate response. She identified the compound. The gap in the sweep protocol was in the threat assessment document that is filed in the administrative archive. She read the threat assessment when it was filed 2 weeks ago. A pause. Tava Aussie spoke again, carrying the specific quality of a wolf revising a classification in real time. The threat assessment is filed in the administrative archive. Maren confirmed. She is assigned to the maintenance of the administrative archive. The documents in it are not classified above her access level. The intelligence chief looked at the alpha. He looked at Maren. His voice came with a quality she had not heard in it before, something that was not administrative authority and was not formal engagement but was more direct than both. How long have you been doing this? She understood the full scope of what he was asking. Not how long she had been tracking the compound but how long she had been doing the thing underneath the compound tracking, the observation, the accumulation, the patient carrying of information in a system that had no formal channel for receiving it from her rank. She answered honestly, 3 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and returned to the council room and spoke to his second in a low voice, and the second moved immediately, with the efficiency of someone executing an instruction that had already been fully processed, toward the north wing corridor. The intelligence chief remained in the anteroom. She sat in the chair the alpha had vacated and looked at Maren with the professional assessment of a wolf who was seeing something that required integration into her existing model. She spoke directly. The briefing you prepared. The structure is the intelligence division's standard format. Maren confirmed. She had read enough intelligence division documents in 3 years to understand the format. Tava Aussie looked at the folder. Then, with the specific quality of a question that was both professional and something more, what else is in the archive that the division does not know you have read? Maren considered the honest answer and concluded it was the only answer worth giving, most of it. The investigation that followed Maren's briefing was conducted with the thoroughness that characterized everything the Kelvrath Intelligence Division did, which was to say it was exhaustive, meticulous, and completed in 48 hours because 48 hours was what the assembly timeline allowed. Tava Aussie led it personally, which Maren understood from the 3 years of intelligence documents she had read was not the standard protocol for an internal investigation but was the correct choice when the investigation's initial lead came from a source outside the formal reporting structure, because external sources required direct handling to ensure the evidentiary chain met the standard for a formal proceeding. Maren was part of the investigation. Not as a subject. As an asset. This designation, conveyed by Tava Aussie in the anteroom in 3 words, was the most significant thing that had changed about Maren's position in the fortress in 3 years, and she received it with the careful attention it warranted and then went back to the West Wing to continue her rotation, because the investigation required her to maintain her normal pattern and the normal pattern was the maintenance rotation. She continued it. She also continued the compound monitoring, now with specific instructions from the Intelligence Division's field team on how to document what she was detecting in a format that met the evidentiary standard. The field team's lead analyst walked her through the documentation protocol in a brief session in the administrative archive that was conducted with the professional efficiency of someone who had quickly recalibrated their assessment of the person they were working with. The investigation produced its first significant result on the second day. The compound source was traced, through the distribution pattern Maren had documented and the Intelligence Division's supplementary physical analysis, to a supply cache in the secondary records room. The archives clerk who used the secondary records room 3 mornings per week was a beta named Sev Tolan who had been with the Kelvrath administrative staff for 7 years. His personnel file showed nothing anomalous. His behavioral profile showed nothing anomalous. His scent profile, run against the compound formulation's chemical family, showed a match at the secondary metabolite level, which was the level that indicated chronic, low-dose exposure rather than incidental contact. Sev Tolan had been handling the compound for at least several weeks. This was the first piece. The investigation required the second, who had directed Sev Tolan to introduce the compound into the fortress, and what its specific purpose was. The second piece arrived through the distribution map rather than through personnel analysis. Maren had documented, across 11 days of tracking, a pattern in which the compound's presence in the 3 identified locations was consistent with a target route rather than a coverage approach. The compound was not being distributed broadly. It was being placed along a specific path in small, precise quantities, the kind of quantities that would accumulate on the person of a wolf who transited that path regularly. The path connected the North Wing service level to the private exercise space the Alpha used each morning between the 4th and 5th hour, which was one of the few regular activities in his schedule that occurred in a space without security escort. The compound accumulation on the path was calibrated, based on the concentration data Maren had documented, to produce an incapacitating dose in approximately 14 days of transiting the path. The assembly began in 6 days. The assembly's first formal session included a morning exercise period for the attending alphas, conducted in the same space, because it was the largest appropriate exercise facility in the fortress. 6 days of additional accumulation along the path, plus the concentration already present, would put the incapacitating dose within the assembly window. Maren mapped this out in her documentation with the clean precision of someone who had spent 3 years organizing complex information into legible sequence. She delivered the completed map to Tava Asi in the administrative archive at the close of the second day. The intelligence chief read it once, set it down, and was quiet for a full 10 seconds. Then she asked one question: could the exercise space be transited at lower frequency to slow the accumulation? Maren had already calculated this. Reducing transit frequency by 50% would push the incapacitating dose beyond the assembly window by approximately 3 days. But doing so would require the Alpha to change his morning routine, which would require either informing him of the specific threat mechanism, which changed his behavioral pattern in a potentially detectable way, or providing a cover reason, which introduced variables that the investigation's outcome would need to account for. Tava Asi looked at her with the professional assessment that had been developing in quality and intensity since the anteroom session 2 days ago. She asked a second question: is there another approach? Maren offered the approach she had been developing since the previous evening. She could neutralize the compound in the 3 locations during her cleaning rotation. The neutralizing compound was available in the maintenance stores as a standard cleaning agent. At the correct concentration, it would degrade the paralytic at the molecular level without producing a detectable trace. She would need 2 additional cleaning passes per location, which was within the normal variation of her assigned rotation and would not be flagged by behavioral monitoring. The intelligence chief was quiet for another 5 seconds. Her voice came precise and flat in the way of someone committing to a decision: do it. Document every pass. The investigation team will verify the neutralization through air analysis at each location within an hour of each cleaning. Maren confirmed. She went back to the West Wing. She neutralized the first location that same evening. The Intelligence Division's air analysis confirmed the compound's degradation within the hour. She neutralized the second location the following morning. The third required 2 passes because the concentration there was higher than the other 2 locations, consistent with its position as the terminal point of the distribution path. While she was conducting the neutralizations, the Intelligence Division was working the Sev Tolan thread. What they found, over the 3 days between Maren's initial briefing and the assembly's start, was not a single actor but a network of 3, Sev Tolan as the inside placement mechanism, a contact from one of the visiting PAC delegations as the external coordinator, and a principal who remained, for the first 4 days of the investigation, unidentified behind the 2 operational layers. The unidentified principal was the problem. A network with its operational layers removed was a disrupted plan, but a disrupted plan with an unknown principal was an incomplete resolution, because the principal still existed and still had whatever interest had produced the plan. The Intelligence Division's work on the principal identification was excellent and was not producing a result at the speed the timeline required, because the principal had covered their involvement with the professional thoroughness of someone who understood intelligence operations and had structured their participation to survive the loss of both operational layers. On the 4th day before the assembly, Maren came to Tava Asi's office in the intelligence wing. She did not have an appointment. She knocked. Tava Asi opened the door and looked at her. Then she stepped back and let her in. Maren placed her notation book on the intelligence chief's desk and opened it to the page she had prepared the previous evening. She had been tracking the compound's distribution pattern for 15 days by this point, and the 15-day pattern contained something the initial 11-day pattern had not, a directional correlation between the highest concentration points and the access schedule of a specific individual. She had not identified this individual from the compound alone. She had identified them from the combination of the compound distribution pattern and 2 years of incidental observation of their behavioral pattern in the West Wing corridor, which was a corridor they used more frequently than their formal role required, always at times that correlated with the compound's presence being at its highest. The individual was not Counselor Darvin Hull, whose scent she had initially detected on the compound. Darvin Hull's scent had been on the compound because he used the third corridor. He used it frequently. His scent was on the corridor itself, deep in the ambient baseline, and the compound trace had absorbed a surface layer of his scent signature from the environment. She had initially interpreted this as direct contact. She had been wrong. She had corrected the error on day 12 when she identified the separation between Hull's ambient corridor presence and the compound's own signature, which originated from a different direction than Hull's primary transit path. She explained this correction to Tava Asi in the notation book, in the same structured format as the original briefing, and then she named the individual whose behavioral pattern correlated with the distribution timeline. The intelligence chief read the page. She read it again. Her voice came with the specific quality of a wolf who has just had a classification revised in a direction that has significant consequences. This is a member of the Assembly delegation. Maren confirmed, yes. A senior advisor to the Westmark Alpha, who arrived with the advance party 6 days ago and has been in the fortress since. Tava Asi set the notation book down. She looked at Maren with the expression that had been evolving in their interactions over 4 days, which had started as professional assessment and was now something that required a different word. She asked, "How long ago did you reach this conclusion?" Maren answered, "Last night." She spent the previous 2 evenings running the error correction and the correlation analysis. The intelligence chief produced a statement that contained no superfluous elements. "You should have come to me yesterday." Maren offered the accurate response. She came when she was certain. An accusation of this significance directed at a member of a visiting Alpha's delegation required certainty. A pause. Then Tava Asi picked up the notation book and walked to the door and said, without looking back, "Come with me." The Alpha King was in the war chamber. Not in the formal sense of the word, no map spread on the table, no officers arrayed around it. He was alone, standing at the north window with a mug of something warm, conducting what Maren recognized from 3 years of observing the early morning fortress as his version of the private preparatory hour that most wolves of significant responsibility maintained in some form. The hour before the day's official demands began, when the person underneath the function had the space to be entirely themselves. He turned when they entered. His gray-gold eyes moved from Tava Asi to Maren and back, and the quality of his attention was the quality she had encountered in the anteroom 4 days ago, the weighing quality, and it had not diminished in the intervening 4 days. If anything, it had intensified. Tava Asi placed the notation book on the war chamber table and delivered the briefing in the Intelligence Division's standard format, which was the same format Maren had used in her original 11-page document, which was the same format Maren had learned from 3 years of reading Intelligence Division documents in the Administrative Archive. The briefing covered the network identification, the compound neutralization, the principal identification in the notation book, and the specific behavioral correlation that Maren had built from her 2 years of observing the individual's pattern in the West Wing corridor. He listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions when she finished. The first about the confidence level on the principal identification, the second about the evidence chain between the notation book's behavioral correlation and the investigation's physical evidence. Tava Asi answered both in the clean, direct register that was the Intelligence Division standard. Then he looked at Maren directly and asked a third question that was outside the format. He asked, "You have been building this observation for 2 years. The behavioral pattern of this individual in the West Wing corridor. What else have you observed about them?" Maren understood the scope of the question. He was not asking for the investigation-relevant information. He was asking for the full picture that 3 years of West Wing mornings had built. She gave it. The specific time patterns of the visits, always between the 3rd and 4th hour, always on days that followed the assembly preparation planning meetings that the advanced delegation attended. The specific sections of corridor visited, not a transiting path but a looping one, covering the access points to the service passages that connected to the North Wing lower level. The specific behavioral change in the pattern over the past 11 days. The visits had become slightly longer, the coverage slightly wider, which was consistent with the escalation timeline of someone monitoring the progress of an operation. He absorbed all of it in the way she had learned he absorbed things, not managing it toward a predetermined conclusion but letting it change the picture. Then he looked at Tava Asi and produced 3 instructions in sequence, each one specific and complete, each one following from the previous with the logic of someone who had already built the full response plan during the briefing and was now transmitting it. The first, the principal was to be placed under passive surveillance for the remainder of the day, no contact, no alert. The second, the compound source in the secondary records room was to be physically secured as evidence, with the full documentation chain that the formal proceeding would require. The third, Sev Tolan and the delegation contact were to be taken into custody simultaneously. In the next 30 minutes, before either could communicate the investigation's progress to the principal. Tava Asi confirmed each instruction and left. The war chamber was quiet. The Alpha King remained at the north window. Maren remained beside the table, because she had not been given any instruction, and her instinct in ambiguous environments was to hold position and gather data while the situation resolved. He spoke to the window, which was the specific quality of a statement being made to the air rather than to a specific recipient, which in her experience meant a statement being processed rather than transmitted, the compound path. The distribution. The timing calibrated to the assembly window. This was not opportunistic. She offered the accurate response, no. The preparation timeline suggested at minimum 3 months of planning. Possibly longer, given the sophistication of the formulation and the sourcing method. He turned from the window. His gray-gold eyes were on her with the full weighing quality, and she met them with the same fullness she had brought to the anteroom 4 days ago, because there was no other quality she had. His voice came with a directness she recognized as his authentic register, the one that existed underneath the formal authority. Why did you not try to report through the standard channel? She answered without any management of the truth. She assessed the probability of a successful escalation through the standard channel as low, given the rank dynamics of the reporting structure and the nature of the information. A report from an Omega maintenance worker implicating a compound trace at parts per million concentration and potentially a senior council member would have been received as a credibility problem rather than a threat report. The standard channel would have produced a mental health flag, a delay, and the consumption of the only window available for action. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, you calculated this before you decided to approach directly. She confirmed, 3 times. The calculation produced the same result each time. He continued looking at her with the gray-gold eyes that were, she noted, in the part of herself that catalogued things even in significant moments, not the eyes of someone who had made a decision about her but the eyes of someone who was still in the process of making it and was not willing to rush the process. He asked, "What else have you calculated in 3 years of West Wing mornings?" She understood the full scope of the question now the way she had understood it in the anteroom. He was not asking for the investigation-relevant information. He was asking for the thing underneath the investigation, the practice, the 3 years of observation and accumulation and patient carrying of information that had no formal home in the Kelvrath hierarchy. She gave it to him with the same honesty she had given everything else. She told him about the archives clerk in the secondary records room and what she had inferred about the budget allocation anxiety in the administrative assistant's desk areas and the guard captain's undisclosed joint injury and the 17 other minor observations she had been maintaining in the notation book that were not significant enough to constitute actionable intelligence but that collectively described the internal health of the fortress with a specificity that no formal assessment had matched. He listened to all of it. He did not write anything down. He did not need to. She understood, from the quality of his attention, that he was one of the wolves for whom the information went in once and stayed. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing that she had not expected and that she was going to spend considerable time afterward understanding. I have been looking for this. She waited. He continued, what you have built in the West Wing. Not the compound detection specifically. The systematic observation of the fortress at the level of daily functioning that exists below the formal intelligence apparatus. The picture of how the place actually works versus how it is supposed to work. I have been looking for a mechanism to produce this for 4 years and have not found one, because the formal intelligence structure is designed to look outward rather than inward and the internal assessment function is too close to the governance structure to be genuinely independent. He looked at the notation book on the war chamber table. His voice came with the register that had no performance in it, the register she was learning to identify as the one that mattered. You have been doing it independently for 3 years with no formal structure and no formal support. That is either a significant waste of capability or a significant argument for formalizing it. I intend for it to be the second. She absorbed this. She asked the question that was the only relevant one. What does formalizing it require? He answered, a conversation that this morning does not have time for, because in approximately 40 minutes the assembly will begin and there are 3 people in this fortress who are about to be formally detained and a principal who is about to be confronted with evidence of a failed operation, and all of that needs to happen in a specific sequence. She acknowledged this. He asked, after the assembly. Will you still be here? She answered. She was assigned to the West Wing maintenance rotation. She would be here unless the assignment changed. His voice came quiet and with a quality she was still calibrating. The assignment is going to change. He moved toward the war chamber door and then stopped, as if something had occurred to him, and turned back. His voice arrived in the register that had nothing to do with the Alpha King and everything to do with the wolf underneath the title. You sat in that anteroom chair for 9 minutes holding a briefing document and waiting for the right moment. You were not afraid. She offered the honest answer, she was afraid. She was afraid of the mental health flag and the delay and the window closing. She was not afraid of him. The gray-gold eyes held hers for 1 full second. Then he went through the door. The Convergence Assembly convened at the 8th hour of the morning. It convened with 5 alphas, 4 visiting delegations, and the full formal apparatus of the Interpact Compact Review that had been preparing for this day for 3 months. It convened without Sev Tolan, who had been taken into custody simultaneously with the delegation contact from Westmark 40 minutes before the Assembly's opening session, both detentions conducted with the clean efficiency of an intelligence operation that had been prepared with full documentation and 0 visible disruption to the Assembly's surface. It also convened without the senior advisor to the Westmark Alpha, who was informed by the intelligence chief in the delegation's private receiving room, 3 minutes before the Assembly's opening, that her participation in the Assembly had been suspended pending a formal proceeding under the Interpact Compact security provisions. The Westmark Alpha received this information in the same receiving room, from the Alpha King of Kelvrath, 5 minutes later. The conversation between the 2 alphas lasted 22 minutes and was, from what Maren was told afterward by Tava Asi in the characteristically brief manner that the intelligence chief transmitted all significant information, a conversation in which Vale Dorn presented the full evidence chain, including the original detection source, identified by position and assignment without name at that stage, to the Westmark Alpha, and the Westmark Alpha demonstrated, over the course of those 22 minutes, that he had not known about the operation and that he understood completely what the evidence chain meant for the relationship between his delegation and Kelvrath. The Assembly opened 11 minutes late. The delay was attributed to a minor administrative coordination issue. No one outside the relevant parties knew the difference. The Assembly ran 4 days. Maren continued her West Wing rotation for all 4 of them, because the Assembly created additional cleaning requirements in the administrative corridors and because the Intelligence Division had asked her to maintain the compound monitoring until the formal proceeding confirmed the source chain's complete dismantling. She maintained it. She delivered the monitoring reports to Tava Asi's office each morning in the same document format she had used for the original briefing. On the second day of the Assembly, Tava Asi stopped by the West Wing with 2 cups of the kitchen's morning brew and sat on the corridor bench outside the administrative archive and handed Maren one of the cups and said nothing for a moment, which Maren understood was the intelligence chief's version of an informal meeting. She accepted the cup and waited. Tava Asi spoke directly, which was her only register. The Alpha has proposed a new position in the Intelligence Division's internal assessment function. The position does not currently exist. He wants to create it with the specific mandate of systematic internal observation, independent of the formal intelligence structure, reporting directly to him and through him to the intelligence chief. He asked me to assess whether the mandate was achievable. I have assessed it. It is achievable, with the correct person and the correct structure. He has already identified the correct person. Maren held the cup and looked at the corridor she had been cleaning for 3 years. The corridor she knew in its morning truth, before the day's performance began, in the light that came through the high west windows and lay across the stone in the specific quality of a place that had given her, in return for 3 years of early mornings, something she had not known she was building until it mattered. She asked, "What does the correct structure look like?" The intelligence chief described it. The position would carry a senior specialist rank, which was a new rank category the Alpha was creating specifically for this function because the existing hierarchy did not have a category for what the position required. It would have access to all non-classified documentation in the administrative archive, which was the access level she already had. It would have a formal channel to the Intelligence Division's analysis team for cross-referencing observation data with documentary and field intelligence. And it would retain the freedom of movement in the fortress's non-secured sections that 3 years of maintenance rotation had produced, because that freedom was, as the intelligence chief stated with the flat precision that was her way of making important points, the core of what makes the function work. Maren listened to all of it. She asked one clarifying question: the morning rotation in the West Wing. Tava Asi looked at her, continued. It is the observation platform. Maren absorbed this. Then she gave the answer, yes. The formal proceeding against Sev Tolan and the Westmark delegation contact was completed under the Interpact Compact security provisions on the 3rd day of the assembly. Both cooperated with the proceeding, which was the correct decision given the evidence chain's completeness, and the cooperation produced the final piece of the principal identification that confirmed what Maren's behavioral correlation had indicated. The principal was not ultimately a Westmark actor in the sense of PAC leadership. She was a financial interest operating across PAC lines who had commissioned the operation as part of a longer horizon strategy aimed at destabilizing the Compact's leadership structure. The Compact's security provisions were extensive, and the response to the confirmed threat was handled through those provisions over the following weeks by the joint intelligence apparatus of the 5 PACs. Maren's role in those subsequent weeks was what the new position's mandate described: systematic internal observation, documentation, cross-reference with the Intelligence Division's analysis. She conducted it from the same corridors she had been conducting it from for 3 years, with the same early morning hours and the same careful attention and the same notation book, now replaced by a formal documentation system that the Intelligence Division's archive had built around the format she had been using independently. The format was, Tava Asi noted in the first formal review session, the most efficient information architecture the division had encountered for this category of intelligence. She said this with the flat precision that was her standard and without any additional embellishment, which was the intelligence chief's highest available form of professional recognition. Maren received it the way she received all significant information, fully, without performance, and filed it in the correct location. The Alpha King found her in the administrative archive on the 7th evening after the assembly's conclusion. Not in the formal capacity of the position review that was scheduled for the following morning. In the manner she had come to understand, over the course of the assembly and the week that followed it, as the way he moved when he was not performing the function of the Alpha King but was simply moving through his fortress as the person who lived in it. He came through the secondary entrance from the North Wing service level, which was the door in her cleaning rotation, and he sat on the archive reading bench across from the shelving unit she was reorganizing, and he was quiet for a moment in the way that someone was quiet when they were deciding whether to say the thing they had come to say or the thing that was easier. She continued reorganizing the shelving because the task was in progress and stopping mid-task was a waste of the organizational momentum she had built. She was also aware that giving him the space of her continued work was the correct move, because the thing he had come to say was not a formal thing and formal things did not require space, they required alignment. He said, eventually, in the register that was not the Alpha King's, "You told me in the war chamber that you were not afraid of me." She confirmed, that was accurate. His voice came with a quality she had been learning to identify, the quality that existed underneath the gray-gold eyes weighing process when the weighing had reached a conclusion. Most wolves in this fortress are afraid of me. Most wolves in the 5 territories carry some version of the reputation before they meet me, and the reputation arrives first and shapes everything that follows. You had the reputation. You had 3 years of documents in the archive that described what this fortress is and how it runs and what I have done to make it what it is. You walked into that anteroom with a briefing document and you were not afraid. She thought about the honest answer. She had spent those 9 days preparing the briefing and thinking about the person it was for, the alpha whose reputation she had read in 3 years of intelligence documents, and she had formed, from those documents, a picture that was considerably more complex than the reputation and considerably more specific. The reputation said feared. The documents said exacting. The distinction mattered. She answered. She was not afraid because the documents told her he processed information rather than managed it toward a predetermined conclusion. A wolf who processes information accurately is not a threat to someone bringing accurate information. The threat would have been in his receiving it as a credibility challenge rather than a report. The documents said he would not do that. She trusted the documents. He looked at her across the reading bench with the gray-gold eyes holding the thing they had been holding since the anteroom, the weighing that was still in progress. His voice came quiet. You trusted documents about me more than most people trust direct experience of me. She offered the accurate response. Documents are less mediated than direct experience. Direct experience of a dominant wolf is shaped by the social response the dominant wolf produces in the observer. Documents are shaped by the outcomes of the decisions. Outcomes are more reliable than impressions. He was still for a moment. Then, with the specific quality that had nothing to do with the Alpha King and everything to do with the wolf who had been standing at the north window with a warm mug before the day's demands began, that is the most unusual way anyone has ever told me that they saw me accurately. She looked at him with the same fullness she had brought to every exchange since the anteroom, because it was the only quality she had ever brought to anything. She answered. She was not trying to tell him that. She was answering his question. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Brief and entirely genuine, the specific expression of a man who has received an unexpected answer and found it precisely correct. He said, and his voice was the voice of the empty war chamber and the north window and the hour before the day's demands, the voice that had no performance in it. Then let me ask a different question. She waited. He continued, 3 years of West Wing mornings. 3 years of accurate observation of this fortress at the level that the formal intelligence structure cannot reach. You have been doing this alone, without structure, without recognition, without any formal acknowledgement that what you were building had value. And then 11 days ago you brought it forward and it turned out to be exactly the thing that saved this assembly and possibly this compact and several lives attached to both. He paused. His voice came very quiet. What did that cost you? Not the corridor approach. Not the 9 minutes in the anteroom. The 3 years. She thought about the honest answer with the care she gave to all significant questions, because significant questions deserved that. Then she answered, not as much as she had expected when she arrived. She had expected the invisibility to be a loss. She had found it was an asset. Invisibility in the correct environment was a tool, not a deprivation. What it had cost was the uncertainty of not knowing whether the tool would ever find a use significant enough to justify the investment. She had not known until 11 days ago whether 3 years of West Wing mornings were building towards something or simply accumulating. He absorbed this. Then, with the specific quality of someone choosing to say the true thing rather than the safe thing, he knew. From the anteroom. From the 9 pages of the briefing. He knew it had been building towards something because things built with that quality of attention always are. He had not known how to reach it until she brought it to him. The archive was quiet in the evening way. The shelving she had been reorganizing was half done, the other half patient beside her. The notation book was on the reading bench between them, the 15 days of compound tracking and behavioral correlation and distribution mapping in its pages, the cipher she had developed in her second year now inside the formal documentation system of the intelligence division because the format she had invented independently was, as the chief had noted, the most efficient information architecture the division had encountered for this category. She looked at him across the reading bench and held the full weight of the past week and the past 3 years and the 11 days and the 9 minutes and the 2 questions in the war chamber and everything she had calculated and everything she had observed and everything she had carried in the West Wing corridors at the 3rd and 4th hour with nothing to receive it. The receiving was happening now. She let it. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the bench, the posture of someone in a conversation rather than a meeting, and looked at her with the gray-gold eyes not weighing anymore but having reached their conclusion. His voice came low and direct. The position review is tomorrow morning. The formal structure, the mandate, the rank. All of it is exactly what Tava described to you. But I want to ask you something outside the position review, and I want to ask it now, before the morning makes it formal. She waited. He asked, is there anything in 3 years of West Wing mornings that told you who I actually am, rather than what the documents said about the decisions I made? She thought about this. She thought about the private reading alcove and the chair positioned at a consistent angle and the lamp worn at the base from repeated handling. She thought about the morning walkthrough of the fortress's operational sections that he conducted once a month through the West Wing administrative corridor, which was not a security requirement and was not a formal obligation and was the kind of thing a wolf did because they wanted to know the people in the lower levels of the building they lived in. She thought about the management protocols documented in the intelligence archive, the ones that nobody had expected from an alpha with his reputation and that she had read with the specific attention of someone comparing what a person was said to be against what their documented decisions revealed about them. She answered, yes. A great deal, actually. The corner of his mouth, such as. She answered. He cared about the West Wing maintenance schedule in a way that no alpha she had read about cared about the operational infrastructure that existed below the formal level of governance. He had adjusted the schedule twice in 3 years to account for staff capacity, which was not a decision that produced any visible outcome and which he had made without being asked. He used the private alcove 3 evenings per week and he went there alone, without staff, which was the behavior of a wolf who needed spaces that his authority did not fill. He conducted the monthly operational walkthroughs at irregular times on a rotating schedule, which was the behavior of a wolf who wanted the honest picture rather than the prepared one. She paused. Then, the documents described the decisions. The decisions described someone who was not the fear. He held her gaze for a long time. Then he produced the question she had not expected and that she would spend a considerable time afterward understanding was the right question. What was he, then, if not the fear? She answered without hesitation, because the answer had been in the notation book for 3 years and she had simply never had the occasion to say it aloud. He was someone who had taken something that needed to be built and built it, and the cost of building it had been paid forward into the thing itself. And the thing itself was the fortress and the pack and the compact and the 5 years of decisions that had made Kelvrath the standard that the other territories measured themselves against. The fear was a byproduct. The work was the point. He was entirely still. The archive was entirely quiet. Outside the high west windows the evening was the dark of a mountain territory at the close of a clear autumn day, the kind of dark that was not heavy but precise, the exact dark that came when all the light had gone and the stars had not yet fully declared themselves. He said, in the voice that was not the Alpha King's and had not been since he entered the archive through the service-level door, I have been working in this fortress for 5 years. I know what every formal assessment says about it and what every intelligence report says about it and what every council session and every security briefing and every post-operation review says about it. I have never had anyone tell me what the 3rd corridor of the West Administrative Wing says about it at the 4th hour of the morning. She answered, she could tell him that. It would take some time. His voice came with the warmth that was, she understood now, not performed, never performed, just rare. He has time. She looked at him across the reading bench in the quiet archive, in the dark that had arrived outside the high west windows, and she thought about the 9 minutes in the anteroom and the 3 years before it and the 11 days of compound tracking and the full weight of what the West Wing mornings had been building toward, and she made the inventory. The inventory produced the same conclusion it had been producing for 4 days, which was the conclusion she had not expected and had not managed away from herself because she had never developed the habit of managing things away from herself. She said, Then she will start with the east end of the third corridor, because that is where the light arrives first, and work her way west. He settled back onto the bench with the ease of someone who had not settled comfortably anywhere in a long time and was finding the adjustment easier than expected. He said, "Start wherever you like." She started at the beginning.